Happy Monday morning, Baker Babes. I'm excited to read to you a little bit more from James and the Giant Peach. Remember, right before we left in our last read aloud, he realized there was a little hole in the peach. Let's read to find out what happens. It was a quite large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't just a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was the curious, bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight toward the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang! The top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. What do you think this is? Anybody have any guesses? What's in the middle of a peach? Good heavens, he said. I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach. Remember, we call that a pit, not a stone. Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave it a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up and see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look, who's here?" And another one said, "We've been waiting for you." James stopped and started at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much that he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown wall behind him. You'd write more than that. More than one sentence. Tell me all about what you're excited about for first grade. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog. You could hardly call that an insect, could you? Then there was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting on a stool directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider. And next to the spider, there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 were squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in the curled-up positions, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying any attention to it. Bring that down just a little bit, buddy. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself. And in the strange greenish light that shone down from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. Miles, honey, turn it down, please. Can you help him, please? I'm hungry, the spider announced suddenly, staring hard at James. I'm famished, said the old green grasshopper. So am I, the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. Everyone's famished, he said. We need food. 4 pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who had happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran a long black tongue delicately over her lips. Aren't you hungry? She asked suddenly, leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. What's the matter with you? The old green grasshopper asked. You look positively ill. He looks as though he's going to faint any second, said the centipede. Oh my goodness, the poor thing, the ladybug cried. I do believe he thinks it's him that we're wanting to eat. There was a roar of laughter from all sides. Oh dear, they said. What an awful thought. You mustn't be frightened, the ladybug said kindly. We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now, don't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat. We've been waiting for you all day long, the old green grasshopper said. We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it. So cheer up, my boy, cheer up, the centipede said. And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all on myself. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable, so he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. Thank you so much, the centipede said. You're very kind. You have a lot of boots, James murmured. I have a lot of legs, the centipede answered proudly, and a lot of feet, 100 to be exact. There he goes again, the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word. And anyway, there is something marvelous, centipede, about having a lot of legs. Or there's nothing marvelous, centipede, about having a lot of legs. Poor fellow, said the centipede, whispering in James' ear. He's blind. He can't see how splendid I actually look. In my opinion, the earthworm said, the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and be able to walk just the same. You call that walking? Cried the centipede. You're a slitherer. That's all you are. You just slither along. I glide, said the earthworm primly. You are a slimy beast, answered the centipede. I am not a slimy beast, the earthworm said. I am a useful and much-loved creature. Ask any gardener you like. And as for you, I'm a pest, said the centipede announced, grinning broadly and looking around the room for approval. He is so proud of that, the ladybug said, smiling at James, though for the life of me I cannot understand why. I'm the only pest in this room, cried the centipede, still grinning away, unless you count old green grasshopper over there, but he's long past it now. He's too old to be a pest anymore. The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. Young fellow, he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice, I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician. Hear, hear, said the ladybug. James, the centipede said, your name is James, isn't it? Yes. Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous, colossal centipede as me? I certainly haven't, James answered. How on earth did you get to be like that? Very peculiar, said Centipede. Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden underneath the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose. Bright green it was, and extraordinarily beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stone or crystal. Yes, Addie? You need to draw a picture, sugar, and check your B's and your D's. Sorry, I lost my spot. Oh, but I know what that was, cried James. It happened to me too, said the ladybug. And me, Miss Spider said. Suddenly, there were little green things everywhere. The soil was full of them. I actually swallowed one, the earthworm declared proudly. So did I, said Ladybug. I swallowed 3, the centipede cried. But who's telling the story anyway? Don't interrupt. It's too late to tell stories now, the old green grasshopper announced. It's time to go to sleep. I refuse to sleep in my boots, the centipede cried. How many more are there to come off, James? I think I've done about 20 so far, James told him. Well, then that leaves 80 to go, said the centipede. "22, not 80, shrieked the earthworm. "He's lying again." The centipede roared with laughter. "Stop pulling the earthworm's leg," the ladybug said. This sent Centipede into hysterics. "Pulling his leg!" he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. "Which leg am I pulling? You tell me." James decided that he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing aloud in all the time he had been with them. "We really must get some sleep," the old green grasshopper said. "We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow. So would you be kind enough, Miss Spider, to make the beds?" A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so that actually it looked more like a hammock than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable," Miss Spider said to the old green grasshopper. "I made it as soft and as silky as I possibly could. I spun it with gossamer. That's a much better quality thread than the one I used for my own web." "Thank you so much, my dear lady," the old green grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. "Ah, this is just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Good night." Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and the ladybug got in. After that, she spun a long one for the centipede and an even longer one for the earthworm. "And how do you like your bed?" she said to James when it came to his turn. "Hard or soft?" "I like it soft, I think. Thank you very much," James answered. "For goodness sake, stop staring around the room and get on with my boots," the centipede said. "You and I are never going to get any sleep at this rate. And kindly line them up neatly in pairs as you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder." James worked away frantically on the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied and loosened before it could be pulled off. And to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours, and by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all and had lined them up along the row of the floor, 22 pairs altogether, the centipede was fast asleep. "Wake up, centipede," whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. "It's time for bed." "Thank you, my dear child," the centipede said, opening his eyes. Then he got down off the sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into his hammock. James got into his own hammock, and oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared with the hard, bare boards that his aunts had always made him sleep upon at home. "Lights out," said the centipede drowsily. Nothing happened. "Turn out the light," he called, raising his voice. James glanced around the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybug was making whistling noises as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at one end of his hammock, wheezing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the very center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. "I said, turn out the light," shouted the centipede angrily. "Are you talking to me?" James asked him. "Of course I'm talking to you," the centipede answered. "That crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on." For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he saw the most extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a gigantic fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long, was standing upside down upon its 6 legs in the middle of the ceiling, and the tail end of this creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. "Is that a glowworm?" asked James, staring at the light. "It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to me." "Of course it's the glowworm," the centipede answered. "At least that's what she calls herself. Although actually, you're quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They're simply lady fireflies without wings. Wake up, you lazy beast." But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede reached out of his hammock and picked up one of its boots from the floor. "Put out that wretched light," he shouted, hurling the boot up at the ceiling. The glowworm slowly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. "There is no need to be rude," she said coldly. "All in good time." "Come on, come on, come on," shouted the centipede, "or I'll put it out for you." "Oh, hello, James," said the glowworm, looking down and giving James a little wave and a smile. "I didn't see you come in. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome, and good night." And then, click, went out the light. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises and the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful in spite of all the shouting and the arguing that went on between them. "Good night, old grasshopper. Old green grasshopper," he whispered. "Good night, Ladybug. Good night, Miss Spider." But before he could go through them all, he had fallen fast asleep. I'll stop there for today. I'll see you again tomorrow.